night, and dancing is prohibited. So that's not a problem for those of us who are very bad dancers, but you can imagine that sort of dampens the enthusiasm down on Soy Cowboy. I would say that there is still widespread wearing of face masks and sort of public hygiene measures sort of put in place, social distancing, temperature checks at public venues, contact tracing through various apps are all still in place and are all still pretty much widely accepted, and the population everyone here follows that quite diligently. So there's no sense, even though there's a sense of an absence of COVID-19, there's no sense of relaxing the guard. I'd say that growing sort of sense of normality, which is very prevalent here in Bangkok, does not extend to the tourist resorts. There has been a ban on incoming flights and tourists since the end of March, and that remains in place with some easing restrictions, which I'll come on to in a minute. But there is a very, very clear, I think I described it in talking to ministers in London, there's a sort of almost an obsession with keeping COVID rates at zero, even if that means large parts of the economy suffer quite dramatically. And I had that conversation with a couple of ministers, cabinet ministers last week, who said that they really did feel there was an acceptance that the economy should take a back seat, and that they would actually contemplate keeping the borders shut to tourists for a prolonged period of time, if needed, to keep COVID at bay. Now, whether that means until there's a vaccine, and that may be more in hope than confidence, or whether that just means until there's a sort of really prolonged period of low transmission and other countries sort of moving in the same direction, it's hard to say. But for the moment, it is very difficult to enter Thailand. Incoming flights, the ban has technically been lifted. There are some categories of people who may now return, apart from non-Thais. But my sense is that this will be a very, very cautious opening up. And while you hear talk of travel bubbles and green lanes, I've been speaking to a number of the ambassadors here who are involved in most of the discussions. It's quite difficult to see how sort of a travel bubble will be very sort of quick to manifest itself. I think more likely is a set of sort of air bridges or green lanes for certain categories of visitors, mainly around business visitors, from a very restricted number of countries. That said, as of last week, there are now a range of people who have previously not been able to return to Thailand who may now return. They include sort of foreign spouses and children of work permits here, foreigners with residency rights here, foreigners married to Thais, foreigners seeking medical treatment here, except for COVID-19, international students, short-stay business travelers, and there's a few guests. There's a category of short-stay business travelers and guests from a range of countries, notably Japan, South Korea, Singapore, China, and Hong Kong. I would say the UK is not on that list, and I can't honestly say that it would be in the first wave for that sort of restricted air bridge type arrangement. Commercial flights, we haven't really seen yet whether this means that commercial flights will start running again into Thailand. That really is a commercial decision. It will depend on numbers. Flights still go out of Thailand, so if you're here, you can still get back to the UK on a range of carriers. EVA is still flying direct once a week, and there are a number of indirect routes. But we're really only seeing, I think we're only going to see a trickle of people entering Thailand, at least from the UK, over the next month or 2 months. For British nationals here, obviously one of the key issues for them is visas and extension of visas. They have benefited thus far from an automatic extension of visas until the end of July, which was part of a lot of discussion from a number of embassies, including ourselves, with the Thai government. Nobody yet knows, because there's no announcement, what will happen at the end of July. And for obviously there's a lot of anxiety as to whether those who are currently needing to renew their visa, so after the end of July, will have to leave the country to do that, and therefore how they would get back in. So there is still a little bit of uncertainty, and we're waiting to hear from the Thai government what they propose. So that's it really, I'd say, for COVID-19 here. I mean, an incredibly impressive response and a healthcare system that's demonstrated it has the capacity to deal with outbreaks and a very effective pandemic response, but no complacency, and really If anything, I would say the fact that we are at 6 weeks with no COVID transmission locally almost makes it more difficult to accept that there might be a small spike by opening up the borders more broadly. And so that's why I think we're seeing a very, very cautious and very phased approach, which I think will continue for some months from the Thai government in terms of, certainly in terms of tourists entering Thailand. Turning now just to the economy, I mean, I think it's fair to say that as in most countries, COVID-19 will worsen what was already quite a challenging situation in Thailand, for households facing stagnant wage growth, rising poverty, droughts, and certainly, the result of a decline in economic activity here has meant household welfare is now sort of a priority for the government. Forecasts for Thailand's growth have been continuously sort of cut down. I think, somewhere between 7, 8%, even 10% contraction in growth predicted. And therefore, the projections for 2020 are pretty low, probably around 5%, though there's some sort of talk that 2021 might see a stronger rebound, partly because of the nature of the economy. I think it's worth noting that even before we went into the COVID-19 pandemic, Thailand's economy was probably underperforming at its slowest pace last year since 2014. So, restrictions on international travel, the looming global recession has really sort of made that situation even worse. Not least because Thailand depends on exports and tourism for more than half of its GDP. 40 million visitors last year. I mean, some talk in the paper this morning of an 80% reduction in that figure for the next year. So that has really hit the economy hard, and that will leave quite a big dent in the tourist industry here. Despite the fact that the government is working very hard to promote domestic tourism to sort of fill that gap, there are quite a large, I would say there are large corners of that industry, particularly midweek, which cannot be satisfied, frankly, by a domestic tourist sort of surge, and which will suffer quite seriously and will result in unemployment and jobs disappearing and businesses closing without an influx of international tourists. It affects, of course, all business sectors in Thailand. Probably the service sector is the next hardest hit from the lockdown, which of course is now gradually easing. So we hope to see some of that rebound. Talk of something like 8 million workers losing their jobs as a result of COVID. Now that was on slightly better figures, economic growth figures. So, it's very hard to see how this will not hit the pockets of a lot of people. And as a result, the government has launched, as you know, a very impressive stimulus package worth more than just over £50 billion, around 14% of GDP, principally around cash handouts, soft loans, so liquidity aid for business. And around 2/3 of the working population have really applied for this support. Most significantly, this 5,000 baht a month for informal workers not covered by the Social Security Fund. This has been covered by borrowing, around £25 billion worth of borrowing, which takes public debt here up to around 57%. That is, in public debt terms, sort of reasonable. So our view and the view of economists here is that there's still headroom to do more. And particularly if borders continue to be effectively sort of closed or locked down, the government has capacity both to increase or extend or repeat some of the cash handouts, or indeed to use some of that stimulus package to invest more strategically in the industries it wants to grow. It means that there are just over half the population, well, half of the working population who are in the informal sector are particularly vulnerable because of the nature of employment, not just in agriculture where it is highest, but also in the service sector and indeed in commerce. And our sense is that, whereas previous economic crises have really hit the richest more, certainly the financial crisis, this is a crisis which is seeing the poorest lose their livelihoods. And that is something I think that is on the top of the government's agenda in how that they support the very poorest and how they maintain financial support for the around 6 million who have already received it. I would say that, even having contained for the moment the spread of the outbreak in Thailand, the global recession will have its impact, as will sort of weakening domestic growth. So much lower tourist arrivals will be reflected in a much weaker activity in retail and accommodation sectors, and particularly in the tourist areas. Weaker domestic consumption and a depressed consumer sentiment will be a factor, and there will probably see some slowing production in some of the key supply chains, particularly around electronics and automotives. There is a good story, which is that particularly around the capacity of Thailand and food production, which has really not been affected by the pandemic. Food products are therefore not affected, and actually in terms of exports, that's quite important for Thailand's economy. So that could be a sign that proportionally higher exports with food products could allow the Thai economy to bounce back better in 2021 than some of the countries. And indeed, the headspace, the headroom that the Thai government has to inject more liquidity into the system is also a very good sign. So IMF, for example, are talking of a good bounce back of around 6% growth rate in 2021, which compares very favourably to many of the countries around us. Finally, turning to the political landscape, and I will try not to be too contentious here, in deference to sort of experts on the line. You all know Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha returned as Prime Minister in the election, in an election that was, let's be honest, fairly heavily sort of weighted in favour of the Palang Pracharat party. I'm not sure where we were in the discussion when you last saw me, but the new Future Forward Party, which was obviously one of the big winners in the election last year, won significant support from young voters, really I think because of its challenge to the domination of the established elite. By sort of February, the Constitutional Court, which let us remember was essentially appointed by the previous sort of military government, had managed to disband the party. Now that has, a lot of the members have moved into a new party, and some of them have defected into different parties. So that has certainly increased the majority for the government's coalition. I think the government is quite rightly taking a number of plaudits for the way it has managed this crisis in a technical sense. There is, I think, some sense that the economic response has not lived up to that masterful health response, and is focused a little bit more around the needs of the rich in society rather than the needs of the poor. And, that is probably something that has been long a factor, or long considered to be a factor in Thailand. There is obviously some nervousness from the pro-rights and liberties voices in Thailand around the government continuing a state of emergency when in practice, local transmission of COVID-19 has effectively been halted. And inevitably there's some suspicion and some questioning as whether this will signal a reversion to a more authoritarian type of government. We will see. I mean, as I say, the government has a rationale for why the emergency decree is needed, which is around being able to respond quickly, particularly across a provincial sort of setup to outbreaks, and to make sure that everyone is sort of conforming to the guidelines. So there are two sides to that story. I think the key for the government is the economy, what comes next, making sure that the financial support package really reaches those who most need it in society. And I know that will be on the mind of ministers, particularly as they sort of, if they're talking about a continuing sort of restriction on incoming tourists, they will need to find some way of ensuring that all elements of the economy are supported. Within the parties, this will be familiar to everyone looking at Thailand. Just about every party is having its own little debate, navel gazing about what goes on within its party. Within the main party, Palang Pracharat, that seems to be resolved with the return of our old friend General Prayut back to lead the party. There has been inevitably some talk about a reshuffle. For the last 2 weeks, I think probably very little business has been done in Parliament, apart from the simple signing of bills and the formulaic stuff, essentially because everyone is waiting for a cabinet reshuffle. Now, when General Prayut took over leadership of the party, that result in a number of sort of key economic figures leaving the executive, and that provokes some speculation that figures like Dr. Somkit, Uttama, the finance minister, and others might be on their way out, and they would be replaced within the party, so that the economic portfolios would change. So far, nothing has happened, and it's entirely possible that, given the sort of importance of the economy to the government, that they may decide that that the current team is what is needed for the current situation. So we will continue to watch that. There has been very little of the sort of protest demonstrations that I think we started to see pre-COVID, particularly around disbandment of Future Forward. And part of that is because of people's adherence to sort of social distancing norms. Part, inevitably, is the impact of the emergency decree and the restrictions that imposes on gatherings. I do think there is still scope for that sort of dissent. Those grievances that have sat in the population for the last decade, particularly if economic hardship starts to take hold, I think there's a prospect of that. Those voices re-emerging over the next few months. We don't see this in terms of violence or orchestrated protest, but I think there is a younger generation which we see emerging with, which is increasingly resistant to this notion of deference to the established elite. Anyway, none of that is in the immediate term. I don't think we're talking about any serious risk to the government in the immediate term, but I think in the longer term, that's something we should keep an eye on. I would say the key issue, which I think also sort of ties in with this idea of people lack of deference, and the big talking point has really been the disappearance of the dissident Wanchalerm in Cambodia, which I think probably took everyone a little bit by surprise how much traction that has got in social media, and you'll see a number of hashtags. Obviously this happened in Cambodia. It's there is a pattern of those who speak out against parts of the establishment sort of disappearing or finding their lives very difficult. This case has really sort of captured, I think, the social media circuit, and a lot of discussion now really about Thailand making sure it holds, it finds out from Cambodia what happened, it tries to find out, it holds the perpetrators to account. And I think a renewed emphasis within Thailand on some of the bills that are sort of making their way through Parliament, particularly around enforced disappearance. So there is there a sort of a story to watch, and I think it's something that is sort of, it feeds into the sense of a younger generation who are less accepting of what they're being told and of the line being given. I have probably spoken for far too long. I apologise. I think I will leave it there to allow for follow-up, and indeed, of course, to allow my colleagues in the Thai embassy to correct anything they feel I have misrepresented. I stress this is sort of my view sitting here, and does not necessarily reflect the totality of the picture. So very difficult to do in a short session. Thank you. I'll hand back to you, sort of Steve and Charlie, for questions.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you. We have a question already from Quinton. I think you're already unmuted, Quinton.
Thank you. Far away.
Yes, please do.
Right. Brian, thank you very much indeed for those remarks, which were very interesting. A couple of things, if I may just ask, which you didn't cover. There's almost an obsession at the moment about relations with China in the States, particularly from Trump, and now the FBI director identifying China as a sort of enemy number one. Clearly, there's a lot of controversy about Huawei in the UK. A lot of concern about what's going on in Hong Kong. I just wonder, given Thailand's relationship with China, particularly the economic links, where Thailand is coming out on that debate, what the Thai government's reaction to that is traditionally been pretty cozy, particularly under military governments with a rather authoritarian stance of the Chinese. I just wonder if there's any change there. And secondly, if I may, just on a practical level, putting a business hat on, is there anything you can say about the embassy's plans to sort of connect up with the business community outside Thailand? I've just done quite a few webinars with the embassy in Jakarta. We've got quite a lot of programs. I just wondered if there's anything else, anything like that, which people like me can tap into in Bangkok. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm almost tempted to say if the Thai embassy's on the line, perhaps they should explain Thailand's position on China rather than me. But I will give you my view since it's my sort of webinar. I think the response has been pretty quiet. I mean, I do think. I cannot decide every. You know, the positioning here has always been to try and keep as close to everyone as possible, to keep in the middle, to keep a balance, essentially sort of neutrality and balance and harmony. I think it becomes much more difficult now as the sort of as the focus is ramped up. I think Hong Kong is obviously a very particular issue, one where we obviously have spoken out quite firmly because of our sort of position as a co-signatory of the joint declaration and our conviction that this actually breaks that. And this is about holding China to its. I think what the Thais may say privately and what they will say publicly are probably two very different things. I would say there's probably sort of some elements of society here whose sympathies lie with anti-protesters that feel that protesters should not be allowed to disrupt the economic life of a country. So it is quite a complex debate. I haven't really seen any, we haven't seen any sort of particular sort of shifts in Thailand's attitudes to China. I mean, it remains obviously one of the big investors here in terms of particularly around infrastructure. But equally, Thailand has shown itself very, very capable and very willing to push back when it sees particularly infrastructure investment that is not delivering enough for the local economy. So this is not a sort of in any sense a state or a country that is rolling over simply because Chinese are offering sort of money on cheap terms. Equally, Chinese tourists remain one of the biggest sort of contributors to the tourist economy. I can't remember exactly the figure, but I think it's like 10 million Chinese tourists. So that's probably about a quarter of international tourists coming into town are from China. So that is a critical element, and that is why I think that and the business is why I think you're seeing talk of travel bubble or special arrangements between China or parts of China and Thailand to try and stimulate those bits of the economy. I would say that my American colleague here, who is a political appointee for the first time, the US ambassador is a political appointee and describes himself very openly as the personal representative of Donald J. Trump, has a very clear view on what we and Thailand and everyone else should be doing about China. And so he's been very active, really sort of with a narrative to combat why we sort of need to resist the influence of China. I don't think that's getting a huge amount of traction in Thailand, where, the business links, the sort of the family links, the sort of the way, this country has managed the big neighbor very effectively for many, 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 many decades, and indeed is sandwiched between India and China. So this is a country that knows how to sort of play the balance. And I think one of the things that we sort of from the UK side are looking at is how we can support those in this region who are looking to sort of create a sort of independent voice and independent assessment of the dynamic. In terms of the business links, I mean, yeah, we've done something with the UK ASEAN Business Council. Currently, our focus is really at the moment on this joint trade review, which is underway, and which is a sort of well, it's now formal discussions between the UK and the Thai trade negotiators to look at what might be the options for a trading relationship now that we're out of the EU. And that will probably run to the end of this year, at which point we will have a sort of a sense of where that is going. Obviously, we're also looking very closely at CPTPP, not just because the UK has declared itself, obviously looking at accession to CPTPP as being a possibility, for our sort of global footprint, but also because there's a huge debate going on in Thailand around sessions CPTPP also. And of course, it's not a sort of all benefits on one side or the other. So there are some very legitimate concerns here, as in the UK and everywhere, particularly here from the agricultural sector. So we want to watch how that plays out and what that might say in terms of our relationship. But I mean, we're always open to sort of doing more of these webinars, not just within, we do quite a lot with the British Chamber and the community here, but it's a good idea to expand it outside. And indeed, I might say to the Chamber, I don't see any reason why British businesses outside of Thailand couldn't be part of the sort of the regular webinars we do with the British Chamber in Thailand. You know, the idea is that we should be offering advice and support to British business wherever it sits. So I will take that away.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. You broke up just actually when you were talking about China, where presumably you're using Huawei equipment. But I think we got the sense of what you were saying. But thanks very much for that.
Let's not read too much into that. Maybe it's just the bad internet here in my residence.
Okay, thanks, Quentin. We have another question now from Fran Charles and John Luckett. I'm going to unmute you, or you may have to unmute yourself.
Trying.
Yes, there we are.
Okay. Good afternoon, Brian. I wonder if I could just ask, the UK government recently released a list of 59 countries for exempted from their travel corridors. And I note that Thailand wasn't on it. Would you, given that your description and sort of the scientific community seem to think that Thailand has done well, would you have any insight as to why Thailand was not on that list?
So I actually have no insight. I will be completely upfront. It was not what I expected to be waking up to on Saturday morning. But you know, this all went back into, it was a decision made out of London, really by the Joint Biosecurity Centre, which sort of had a conversation with the Public Health England. They had a set of, they have some science methodology where they look at various factors. It's not just about transmission rates, it's about some of the epidemiology, some of the point prevalence. So I don't know why the decision was made that way, but I'm assured that there is a scientific methodology behind it, and that is why at this stage, Thailand has not been included. There is, I understand, a review process, and I think every 3 to 4 weeks, this will be looked again. So you know, if I were the Thai ambassador to the UK, I would be asking what is the methodology, and what do our scientists need to sort of produce to sort of reassure you that this situation is as good as it looks. Obviously, I'm doing my part. I mean, we feed back quite a lot of the information. We have very good links with the Ministry of Health here, and we feed back what they tell us about their methodology, their sort of contact tracing, the rates and the underlying capacity. But ultimately, these decisions are made by British health professionals in the Joint Biosecurity Centre. I will certainly be hoping and trying to see if I can persuade them to look at the data again and reassess Thailand's position on that.
Thank you. It's interesting. Jeremy Hunt will be on a webinar this evening through the Royal Society of Medicine, so I might have a chance to ask him the same question.
Please do. He may give you a more forthright answer, since he doesn't work for the government, so technically, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. We have a question from Adrian now. So, Adrian, you might just need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Charlie.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Brian. I completely understand and agree with the praise that you've given us how well Thailand has coped with this, and how their medical system has really shown other people how to do it. Interesting that you said that's almost led on to, I know you used the word slowly, almost an obsession with keeping the infection rate low or zero. That's become far more of a priority than economic well-being, which is in many countries. But if we work on the assumption that the virus is going to continue to flare up in different parts of the world until finally a vaccine is found, do you think that Thailand is going to remain as restricted in its access until the point of vaccine? And if that is right, how would you suggest we best engage during that period?
So I think it's very difficult to answer, because I really don't think the public health officials or the government here has thought that far ahead. I mean, I will say, I mean, this is an entirely personal view, but I think it would almost be easier to open up if transmission rates were running at around 10, 20 rather than 0, because people would then be, there would then be an understanding that this is something that is going to live with us for quite some time, and this is just something that the health system can cope with. You know, it is a reality. I think because it's 0, and I think also, you know, a lot of members of the government have a sort of military background. They see these things in terms of a war against the virus, and in any war, you accept there are some parts that are going to sort of suffer for the greater good. And you know, the sense I get from speaking to ministers is that they are committed to keeping the economy on the back burner if needed for a prolonged period to keep COVID out. Now, I think part of that is maybe not really looking, you know, more than 6 months ahead and thinking, well, in 6 months it may look different, or there may be a vaccine. I think if there isn't, then I think that frankly, I think that becomes unsustainable. I think you will find a lot of voices within Thailand saying, look, the damage from keeping the borders closed, from keeping the sort of the key parts of our economy sort of under lock and underperforming are far greater, particularly when we literally have a system that can cope with some modest, isolated and modest spikes. So I think, you know, in terms of how we engage, I mean, I think it's, you know, I think the cautious approach, we can take advantage of the cautious approach here in Thailand. Business will be the first things to open up. And if you look at the sort of categories of people that are being discussed in terms of green lanes or increasing access to Thailand from overseas, it really is around business visitors. So, you know, I was talking to my Singaporean colleague, you know, who is discussing with the Thais some sort of arrangement whereby short-term business visitors can come in, you know, quarantine for a day, do their business, you know, have a clear schedule and go out again. So I think, you know, that is sort of where the government is heading in terms of how it manages an economic opening up, sort of a return to some normality, while keeping sort of the highest risk countries and the highest risk categories out. You know, already, I mean, it's certainly, you know, I was looking at the rules, you know, so I think at the moment, entry into Thailand is really predicated on those who are looking to return to a life here. Hasn't really focused yet on two-way business. So there is no, for instance, there is no real mechanism whereby business people sitting here in Thailand could take a short trip out, you know, to visit their factories or their headquarters somewhere else and come back with preparing all the documentation in advance. So at the moment you go out, you need to do all the process and the documentation, which the Thai embassy handles in London, to come back in. And while there is in theory a route back in practice, a lot of people are still finding it quite difficult to work through that. So I think that is the next stage. And you know, the sort of discussions that I would be having, particularly the Ministry of Commerce here, are around if we're going to sort of facilitate sort of two-way short business visits, we need to sort of look at what sort of mechanisms are in place to allow that to happen, what sort of testing you need before and after, how we can sort of manage whatever the quarantine period is in a reasonable fashion. You know, can you go down the way of, I think it's Hong Kong or Taiwan, and have sort of, you know, some sort of tracing app that allows you to sort of your moves to be monitored. You know, there are a range of technical solutions. Personally, I think I think it's hard to see 6 months from now there not being a lot of pressure for the economy, for the restrictions to be lifted a bit more in terms of entry into Thailand. But I think tourism is going to be a slow and you know, it's hard to argue that it shouldn't be kept at a sort of very sort of phased, cautious return, given some of the experiences of countries elsewhere in the region, particularly, well, Singapore, there's migrant workers, but Korea, elsewhere, where you start to see sort of waves coming back if you open up too quickly. And I do think caution here really is the watchword. And I think at the moment, most of the population really buys into that. I was having, I'll tell you, I won't name him, but I said to him, Minister, there just seems to be sort of an unfounded level of fear of COVID-19 in a country with sort of, with no local transmission for 6 weeks, as opposed to the United Kingdom, where there seems to be an appallingly low level of fear in a country that frankly could do with a bit more. So I think there's a sort of there's a dichotomy there.
I think that's the point, because it's interesting, because we look at the transmission levels in Thailand from this country and think, blimey, those are low, and yet the restrictions that exist in Thailand are far more profound than perhaps exist now at the moment. But there you have it.
Good.
I think I saw Narissa waving, physically waving. Do you have a question, Narissa? I'll just unmute you. Left from my list. There we are.
Narissa, you're still...
Yes. Hello.
Sometimes
Hi,
it just
Brian.
lags.
Hi, Narissa.
Hello, how are you?
Good.
I just thought that the reason that Thailand wasn't allowed entry into the UK was because of the very stringent quarantine measures if anyone tries to go to Thailand from here. Like, I would like to go back to Thailand. I cannot get back to Thailand. I don't see why I should go and stay in a hotel at my expense for 2 weeks, especially as I've had the virus. So it seems to me that it's also an underlying racism issue. I mean, Anutin, the health minister, has been on record saying that, white people or Caucasians are dirty, they don't wash, they shake hands and all that sort of thing. So I wondered what you thought about that, really.
Well, we all know Anutin sometimes speaks colorfully without necessarily meaning what he says, and I'm pretty certain that is not actually his view. But no, I don't actually think it's not reciprocal at all, because actually there are a number of countries on the exempt list. I probably shouldn't say this, but there are a number of countries on the exempt quarantine list who equally have quarantine on British nationals entering those countries, or indeed in the case of New Zealand, you can't, or Australia, you can't actually get in. So I do think it has nothing to do with reciprocity. It is down to whatever science methodology the Joint Biosecurity Centre is using. If I thought that negotiating some sort of green lane between the UK and Thailand would help, I would do it. But I would also feel very foolish approaching the Thai government and saying why they should consider the UK, which clearly has a higher rate of transmission, as a priority for those with green lanes. So I think my focus is really on just getting the medical science right at the UK end, so that the right decisions can be made independently of reciprocity around entry into the UK. And here, obviously, we would like to understand a little bit more from the Thai government on how they propose to sort of relax or implement quarantine and restrictions going forward. And part of that is not just about quarantine; it's about the documentation, the tests you need to enter. And as I said before, it's partly about those who are in Thailand being able to go out and come back and, if you like, pre-plan a visit. Hopefully Thai MC colleagues have been on the line and have heard your plea, Narissa, about how you can come back, which obviously we would love to see you back. So let's keep our fingers crossed.
Thank you.
Okay, has anybody else got any more questions before I pass back to Steve? Peter, I think I've seen your hand raised a couple of times. Yeah.
Thanks, Charlie. Good morning, Brian, and thanks very much for an interesting update. I was in Thailand in February and March, and I got one of the last flights back. And over that period, I could actually see how well the Thai authorities were handling the pandemic. you know, the messages that they were given to the public, the mask wearing, the sanitation, the hygiene, was incredible. And I felt very, very frustrated why the British government were not following such a good lead. How is that information passed from country to country? Because I think the British government have made some fundamental mistakes where they could have really learned from best practice from a country such as Thailand.
So, I mean, the answer to that is, I mean, we do quite a lot of work out of the embassy, collecting information from the Ministry of Public Health, not just about the measures being undertaken, but about the impact and how they are assessing the effectiveness. And all of that we feed back we were feeding back on a weekly basis to a sort of central repository, in fact, that takes all the experiences from across the world and puts them together. And so there are a number of papers being produced by the sort of COVID sort of teams in the UK around lessons learned from, say, social distancing, mask wearing, you know, the sort of 2 meters as opposed to the 1.5 meter, the 1 meter distance, and all of that gets sort of combined. And they have a number of key comparator countries, and they have a whole basis of data being fed in. I assume, I mean, my assumption is, and I believe it's true, is that is what then sort of gets fed into sort of the Public Health England and the Biosecurity Centre in terms of giving, you know, assessing what advice they're giving to the government about, from a science or medical point of view, what the right response would be. But, you know, equally in all countries there is a political dimension as well, and part of this is about the economic balance. It's the same in Thailand as it is in the UK. There needs to be a balance struck, and part of it, I think, is about you know, public acceptance. I mean, it is a fact that, you know, any of us who lived in Asia, you know, not just in Thailand, in China, you know, the minute you have a cold or the minute there's pollution in the streets outside, we all put on a mask. There is no sort of stigma. There's no sort of sense that it's usual. It's you know, I have 3 toddlers, you know, a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old, who will automatically go grab their little mask and put it on the moment we step out the door. It is just what you do. So I think part of it is also maybe an assessment of how accepted this would be. And you know, we have certainly a population in Thailand that is very committed. You know, maybe a little bit of fear is a good thing. It's very committed to doing the things that are needed to keep this disease at bay. You know, and you know, certainly going into shops here, you would think with no local transmission, people would be a lot more relaxed on social distancing or mask wearing. They're not. I mean, people are you know, this is in a sense the new normal. Yeah. So I agree with you. There are some great lessons to be learned. You know, I quite honest, if I was going back to the UK, I'd be wearing masks on public transport if I went out into the supermarket, just because that's sort of what I'm used to, and I've seen here firsthand the effect it has.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Thank you.
Right, I think because it's approaching 11 o'clock, I'm going to hand back to Steve, who I think is going to summarise and talk a little bit about our next talk, which is in a couple of weeks' time. So I've just unmuted you, Steve. You might need to just confirm that at your end.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted.
You are, yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank Brian very much for what has been a very useful update on a number of fronts. I mean, I think it's very impressive to hear how Thailand has actually dealt with the virus so far, and I think it illustrates. I think one of the big problems is, I'm not saying it's easy, well, it's relatively easy to go into lockdown, but actually it's a lot harder to get out of lockdown, and that's the problem which I think is facing many countries around the world. I mean, you can see this from countries such as New Zealand, where I was earlier in the year. To come out of lockdown is something that's a real risk, because you've managed to effectively deal with the control, or certainly control the virus as much as possible within your own borders. Once you start opening the country to bring people in, that's when the real problem comes. And when you do that, and getting the balance right, I think many governments across the world are wrestling with that particular problem at the moment. But it's very useful for us to get this from the horse's mouth from Brian, to get a general update also on the economic front, because clearly the longer you keep the lockdown in place, the more impact that has on the economic front. And in Thailand, that's going to hurt a lot of people. And clearly, it's a very expensive option to try and keep coming when you're subsidizing the problem. You can only do that to a certain point. And particularly in countries such as Thailand, where tourism is so important, clearly you want to get tourism back on track. But again, how you do that is a challenge in itself. On the political front, that brings in a lot of related issues as well. So you've got a very interesting melting pot, which many countries are going through at the moment. I think one good thing that this has shown through the pandemic is how we can have these meetings, these Zoom meetings, because I think, and not wanting to trespass too much on Brian's time, but I think it would be very helpful to have a further update in 2 or 3 months' time, because I think many of us are looking to see what's going on in Thailand. We are picking up intelligence and feedback on our own fronts, but I think it is very useful to pick that up from the embassy directly. And as Quinton mentioned earlier, if there are any particular commercial briefings in particular that are taking place, I think it would be very, very useful to offer that to Anglo-Thai Society members as well, because a number of those will be looking at it to see when business flows might return, when we can actually think about planning a visit back again. Myself, I'm looking probably near the end of the year going back to Thailand, but again, it's useful to have this gauge to know when that's going to be possible. But a big thank you to Brian for giving us the update. I think most people would have found it very interesting. I'm not sure if Kun Pisanu is on the line. I saw him come in and off the line, whether he'd like to say anything. If he's not actively on the line, I know he's offered to give us a talk at the end of September, and we're very grateful to that. And I think we will be using the Zoom facility far more, where we can bring people in and out, and we can do this at relatively short notice as well, because it's not inconveniencing too many people to come in on the Zoom front. But I'll just move on to the next talk. Andrew will be putting around more details about this, but this is due in 2 weeks' time. It's on Wednesday the 22nd. It is coming again from Thailand, so it will be in a relatively early start. 10 o'clock seems to be quite a convenient time for people to join us. It will be from a Thai doctor, and it will be focused really very much on the COVID-19 pandemic itself, giving more details about how Thailand has actually controlled the virus so far, elaborating more on what Brian has had to say. But it'll be more intense and more focused on Thailand's response to COVID-19. And again, in 2 weeks' time, we'll be interested to see whether any measures have been taken to lift the lockdown, because I think that's a bigger challenge in itself. Once you're actually in lockdown, coming out really is. Sorry about that.
Oh, we lost Steve.
It wasn't Barbara ringing me to say it's time you left the meeting. But a big thank you to Brian. Big thank you to everybody who's actually come in on the call. It is very, very good to see so many members joining these meetings, because I think this is going to be, unfortunately, this is going to be the way forward for the next probably 2 or 3 months. So I think all our meetings will be taking place over Zoom, but it is an excellent facility, and it's actually showing how well it works. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you at future meetings. And again, if anyone has got any feedback on this, on the meeting itself, please feed that back to me directly, or to Andrew, or to Charlie, because we are. And if anyone's got any other suggestions on other Zoom meetings that we might like to bring in, we're looking for as much feedback as possible. So we look forward to receiving that. And thank you once again for joining us today. It's been much appreciated.
I think Pisanu may want to give you some feedback now.
If anyone's got any feedback, we'd be happy to take it. Yes.
I think Pisanu wants to speak.
Oh, good. I'll be delighted if Pisanu was. Pisanu?
Yes, Steve, thank you very much. Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity.
Not at all.
Well, my apologies that I come in late, because this morning we at the embassies are busy with the monkey business. you may know if you follow the news, you know, what we are trying to do is just exercise utmostly to prevent one clippings from a non-British NGOs to harm the total trade relations between the United Kingdoms and Thailand. Brian, I thanks so much for all the good words about the Thailand management on COVID virus. We are also working very diligently to ensure that the British gentlemen and ladies who has a Thai spouse would be able to travel to Thailand very soon to reunion with their family in Thailand. For the British business, we are trying to work very hard to see that they can return to Thailand to look after the business very well. But I also thanks all the Anglo-Thai society's members for your kind interest and for your support and understanding for all the measures introduced by the Royal Thai government, which we consider ourselves successful in terms of the management of COVID virus. We also look forward that very soon, if there is a review of the British government on the country list that will be allowed to travel to Thailand, Thailand will be integrated to that list as well as Vietnam, which already in the list. These are things that it is the commitment of the Royal Thai embassies to work with maximum efforts to ensure that our relations would continue to grow and healthy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kumpasano. Thank you for joining us. And if we can be of any further help to you at all, you know how to contact us, and please do that. And we look forward to keeping in touch and to hearing you speak in September. We're all looking forward to that.
Yes.
Thank you, Kumpasano.
Probably I may send you, and if it is the interest of Anglo-Thai society, I probably ask to talk about the monkey livelihood in Thailand for the ATS members.
we look forward to that, Kumpasano, and good to see you looking so well. Thank you. Thank
you so much.
And thank you again to Brian, and thank you everybody else for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you all again over the next few weeks and months. And in the interim, please stay safe. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Just a note as well, if there are people that you know that want to see this presentation and this talk by Brian but weren't able to connect today, we are recording this, so we will be able to have that recording available, and it will be put on the ATS website, and I'll also share the link on Facebook that you can share with people that weren't able to make this meeting this morning, so that will be available. Okay?
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.